In 1892, on the banks of the Monongahela River in Pennsylvania, gunfire echoed through the steel mills of Homestead. Workers lay wounded. Smoke rose from the furnaces, and anger filled the air. Men inside those factories worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, in heat so intense it burned the skin, for wages that barely kept their families alive. This was one of the bloodiest labor conflicts in American history, and the factories at the center of it all belonged to Andrew Carnegie. Yet at the moment when his workers were fighting and dying, Carnegie himself was nowhere near the battlefield. He was in Scotland, walking through quiet countryside, reading books, and saying nothing, while his empire turned violent in his absence. What makes this moment so disturbing is what came next. Just a few years later, in towns across America, peaceful buildings began to open their doors. Public libraries, clean and silent, filled with light and knowledge. Above their entrances was carved the same name, Carnegie. Children sat inside reading books paid for by the fortune that had once been extracted from their father's labor. The same steel money that had fueled conflict now funded education. It forces an uncomfortable question. Was Andrew Carnegie a ruthless industrialist who broke unions and exhausted workers, or a visionary philanthropist who gave millions the chance to learn and rise? To understand this contradiction, we must go back to his childhood. Carnegie was born into real poverty in Scotland. Hunger, uncertainty, and humiliation. He watched his father lose work and his family lose dignity. Poverty did not simply make life hard, it reshaped his mind. Something inside the young Carnegie hardened. He did not grow up dreaming of wealth or power. He grew up terrified of being poor again. That fear crossed the Atlantic with him when he came to America. It followed him into his first job as a telegraph boy, into the railroads, and eventually into the steel mills that would make him the richest man in the world. Every decision he made was driven by a single instinct: never go back. This is not the story of a simple hero or a clear villain. It is the story of what happens when hunger is given power. When Andrew Carnegie arrived in America, he did not look like a future titan of industry. He was thin, nervous, and constantly alert, as if poverty itself were chasing him. His first job was as a telegraph boy in Pittsburgh, a city already humming with machines and ambition. While others went home after work, Carnegie stayed late, memorizing signals, studying messages, and learning how power really moved, not through strength, but through information. From telegraphs, he moved into railroads, the arteries of the American economy. Carnegie watched closely, not just how steel rails were laid, but how costs were calculated and how pressure was applied. He realized success was not about working harder. It was about building systems that never rested. Machines did not complain. Numbers did not strike. Remove emotion, and decisions became cleaner, faster, and far more ruthless. When Carnegie entered the steel business, he did not reinvent steel. He reinvented how it was produced. Every second inside his mills was measured. Every movement optimized. Wages were cut wherever possible. Hours extended without mercy. Workers were no longer craftsmen. They were components, replaceable and invisible. The mills burned day and night, glowing with progress, while the men inside them aged faster than time itself. From a distance, it looked like genius. America needed steel, bridges, railroads, cities, and Carnegie delivered it cheaper and faster than anyone else. Newspapers praised him. Politicians admired him. But up close, the cost was written on human bodies: exhaustion, injury, silence. Carnegie rarely visited the factory floor. Distance made efficiency possible. Distance turned suffering into numbers. By the time his empire surged forward, Carnegie was no longer just a businessman. He was a system, precise, relentless, unstoppable. What began as a desperate escape from poverty had transformed into domination. The machine he built no longer cared who it crushed, and it was moving too fast for conscience to catch up. By the 1890s, Andrew Carnegie had climbed higher than almost any man in history. His steel formed the skeleton of America. Railways across continents, bridges over rivers, cities rising skyward. Every blast furnace added to a fortune so vast, it lost human meaning. Millions blurred into abstractions. Power no longer felt earned. It felt inevitable, as if the world itself were bending to his momentum. To the public, this was the golden age of progress. Newspapers praised efficiency and growth. Carnegie was celebrated as proof that discipline and intelligence were rewarded. But inside the mills, reality was harsher. Workers labored 12-hour shifts surrounded by molten steel and constant danger. Injuries were routine. Death was accepted. The mills never slept, and neither did the hunger for profit. Carnegie himself lived far from the heat. He wrote letters, read philosophy, and discussed morality, while managers enforced brutal cost-cutting in his name. Distance became his shield. If he did not see suffering, he could measure it. If he could measure it, he could justify it. In his logic, inefficiency was not just bad business, it was a moral failure. As his empire expanded, Carnegie stopped competing with rivals and began shaping the rules themselves. Smaller producers collapsed or were absorbed. Unions weakened. Resistance felt pointless. His power relied not only on force, but on inevitability. You could not fight what seemed permanent, and permanence became his greatest weapon. Yet beneath the triumph, a contradiction grew. Carnegie spoke of culture and moral duty, but his empire ran on relentless pressure. The richer he became, the more fragile his image grew. For the first time, it was not poverty that haunted him, but judgment. And that judgment was waiting. In 1892, the machine finally broke its silence. At the Homestead Steel Works near Pittsburgh, workers reached a limit they could no longer endure. Wages had been slashed, hours remained brutal, and skilled men were being replaced. When negotiations failed, the workers resisted. They did not see themselves fighting a company, but a system that had erased their humanity. What followed would scar American history forever. Carnegie's partner, Henry Clay Frick, answered the strike with force. Armed Pinkerton agents were hired to seize the mill. At dawn, barges carrying the agents moved up the river toward Homestead. Workers and townspeople were waiting. Shots rang out. Chaos exploded. By the end of the day, men lay dead on both sides. Smoke rose again, but this time from gunfire, not furnaces. While violence consumed Homestead, Andrew Carnegie was far away. He was in Scotland, reading and writing, claiming distance from events unfolding in his name. Officially, he opposed violence. Unofficially, the system he built made violence inevitable. His silence spoke louder than commands. By stepping away, he allowed brutality to occur while protecting his image as a moral thinker. Public opinion shifted. Newspapers questioned him. Supporters hesitated. The strike was crushed, unions collapsed, and the mills reopened. The machine survived, but something fundamental changed. For the first time, Carnegie could not escape consequence. Homestead followed him across the ocean, into memory, into history. It was no longer possible to separate efficiency from blood. Homestead was more than a labor conflict. It was a mirror. And in that reflection, Carnegie saw what power looked like when stripped of distance and excuses. The cost of progress was no longer theoretical. It was human. After Homestead, something inside Andrew Carnegie shifted. The mills ran again, and profits returned, but the noise did not fade. He had escaped punishment, yet memory followed him. For the first time since childhood, fear returned. Not fear of poverty, but fear of judgment. Wealth had protected him from rivals and failure, but it could not protect him from history. Carnegie began to understand that money built power, but stories built legacy, and the story forming around his name was unstable. Workers saw indifference. Critics saw hypocrisy. Even admirers felt doubt. Carnegie had mastered systems and numbers, but now faced something he could not calculate: how he would be remembered after the furnaces went cold. So he turned to ideas. If steel had built his empire, philosophy would rebuild his image. He wrote essays and speeches defining what wealth should mean. In 1889, he published what became his moral shield, The Gospel of Wealth. It argued that the rich were trustees, morally obligated to give their wealth back to society. The argument was elegant and dangerous. Carnegie did not reject inequality. He accepted it as necessary. Wealth, he believed, must first be concentrated, even brutally. before it could be distributed wisely. The taking came first, the giving came later, and the decision of what was wise belonged to the wealthy themselves. With this idea, Carnegie reframed his past. The mills, the suffering, the strikes became preparation for good works to come. Whether sincere or strategic, the philosophy worked. He had found a way to live with himself and to argue with history. With his philosophy defined, Andrew Carnegie moved with the same precision he once applied to steel. This time, the product was legacy. He did not give emotionally or randomly. He gave systematically. Town by town, libraries rose, quiet temples of learning placed where factories once roared. Books, he believed, could shape ambition more effectively than wages ever could. Universities followed. Research institutions. Endowments for science, music, and peace. Each gift came with conditions. Communities had to maintain the buildings and prove commitment. Charity became a contract. Carnegie was not interested in relief. He wanted transformation. The same discipline he demanded from workers was now demanded from recipients. As donations expanded, his reputation shifted. Newspapers praised generosity. Children learned under his name. Slowly, the steel magnate faded, replaced by the benefactor. Carnegie understood something vital. People remember the buildings they enter every day, far more than the factories they never see. Yet the irony remained. The wealth being distributed had been extracted through relentless pressure. Carnegie did not deny this. He believed outcomes justified methods. If millions benefited later, the suffering earlier became acceptable, even necessary. Progress, in his view, was never gentle. In his final years, he accelerated the process. He sold his steel empire and gave away nearly all his fortune. To die rich, he believed, was failure. Giving became his final project, executed with urgency, as if time itself were the last rival. By the time Andrew Carnegie reached the end of his life, the world struggled to judge him. His name stood on libraries, universities, and institutions devoted to peace. At the same time, it lingered over broken strikes and exhausted workers. Two Carnegies existed at once, and history was forced to hold them together. Praise and criticism followed him in equal measure, neither strong enough to erase the other. Supporters argued that few men had given so much. Millions learned to read because of his libraries. Education spread where opportunity had once been absent. To them, Carnegie proved that wealth, guided by intellect, could elevate society. He accomplished what governments often failed to do, turn private fortune into public good. Critics saw something darker. They saw a man who accumulated wealth through pressure and silence, then used philanthropy to cleanse his image. They asked whether generosity given after exploitation could ever be moral. Were the library's gifts or apologies carved in stone? And could good outcomes ever erase harmful beginnings? Carnegie himself offered no final confession. He believed struggle built character, and that hardship was unavoidable. His duty, he felt, was not to remove suffering, but to shape what followed it. That belief still echoes today in debates about billionaires, responsibility, and power. This is why Carnegie still matters. He did not leave answers. He left a blueprint: accumulate relentlessly, give strategically, and allow history to argue the rest. And history is still arguing. In the end, Andrew Carnegie left behind more than buildings or wealth. He left a mirror. His life reflects a question that refuses to age. What does society owe when success is built on inequality? Carnegie trusted systems more than sympathy, outcomes more than intentions. In doing so, he reshaped how the world thinks about wealth and responsibility. Walk into a Carnegie library today, and the past feels distant. The air is calm. Knowledge is free. Children read without knowing the cost once paid for these walls. That distance is part of his genius, and part of the problem. Carnegie understood that institutions outlive suffering, and that memory softens with time. Modern billionaires still follow the path he carved. They disrupt, accumulate, defend efficiency, and promise to give back later. The language has changed, but the logic remains. Create immense value. Accept collateral damage. Fund solutions after the fact. Let history debate the balance. Carnegie was not an exception. He was the prototype. The platforms are digital now, but the philosophy remains familiar. His life teaches us that morality in the age of power is never clean. It is negotiated, delayed, and often justified after the damage is done. The question is no longer about Carnegie alone. It is about us, and whether we continue to accept the same bargain he offered. In the final accounting, Andrew Carnegie leaves no comfort, only responsibility. His life proves that one person can shape a century, and that the same force that builds nations can wound the people within them. He showed how power works when it is disciplined, strategic, and relentless. History remembers him through stone and silence. Libraries stand where furnaces once roared. Over time, suffering fades, and symbols remain. This is the dangerous beauty of legacy. It smooths sharp edges. Carnegie understood that if you shape the future well enough, the past becomes negotiable. But the questions he leaves behind are not negotiable. If wealth is created through pressure, does giving later absolve the harm? If progress demands sacrifice, who decides whose lives are spent? These are not historical questions. They echo in the modern world. Carnegie did not give us answers. He gave us a pattern. Accumulate first. Justify later. Give strategically. Let time soften the verdict. Whether that pattern leads to progress or repetition depends on what we choose to learn. Because the unsettling truth is this: Carnegie was not an anomaly. He was a mirror of ambition without limits. In the final moments of this story, Andrew Carnegie stands not as a man, but as a question mark carved into history. He escaped poverty, mastered power, and tried to outrun judgment with generosity. His name is whispered in libraries, not shouted in factories, until you look closer. Carnegie's life reveals an uncomfortable truth. History remembers progress more clearly than pain. Buildings remain. Stories soften. Over time, results begin to justify methods. This pattern did not end with him. It repeats wherever power outruns accountability. So that the final question is not whether Carnegie was good or bad. That debate never ends. The real question is whether we will continue choosing efficiency now and morality later. If we do, Carnegie is not history. He is a warning. His steel has rusted. His libraries still stand. But the dilemma he left behind remains unresolved. And perhaps that is the most honest ending. Not praise, not condemnation, but reflection. Because the future will judge us the same way we still judge Andrew Carnegie, by what we chose to build and what we chose to ignore along the way.